Picture this moment. You wake up tomorrow morning, and without thinking, you reach for your phone. Your fingers know exactly where it is, even in the darkness. You check your messages, scroll through notifications, maybe open that same app you always open first. You haven't made a conscious decision to do any of this. It just happens. Now imagine walking to your kitchen. Your feet carry you there automatically. You start the coffee maker, or maybe you reach for that particular mug, the one that fits perfectly in your hand. Again, no conscious thought. Your body is moving through a sequence it has performed thousands of times before. This is the invisible architecture of your life. It's these patterns that govern your mornings, your work days, your relationships, your health, your happiness. They're not random. They're not accidents. They are the result of something far more profound than most of us realize. What if I told you that understanding this invisible force could change everything? What if the key to transformation wasn't willpower or motivation, but something much more fundamental? What if the secret to becoming who you want to be was already hardwired into your brain, waiting to be understood? The book that changed how I see human nature is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. But this isn't just another self-help book gathering dust on a shelf. This is a window into the neurological reality of how we become who we are. Duhigg, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, spent years investigating the science behind why we do what we do. What he discovered will fundamentally shift how you see yourself, your relationships, and your potential. This book isn't about tips or tricks. It's about understanding the operating system of human behavior. It's about recognizing that you are not a victim of your patterns, but their architect. And once you understand how the architecture works, you can rebuild it. I've lived with these ideas for years now. I've seen them transform not just my own life, but the lives of people I care about. This isn't theory. This is the practical science of human change, told through stories so compelling you'll forget you're learning. We're going to journey through 9 chapters that will take you from the individual habits that shape your daily life, to the organizational habits that drive companies and institutions, to the social habits that move entire societies. Each chapter is a revelation, a piece of a puzzle that, when complete, shows you exactly how transformation happens. Here's the journey we're about to take together. Chapter 1, The Habit Loop, How Habits Work. Chapter 2, The Craving Brain, How to Create New Habits. Chapter 3, The Golden Rule of Habit Change, Why Transformation Occurs. Chapter 4, Keystone Habits, or The Ballad of Paul O'Neill, Which Habits Matter Most. Chapter 5, Starbucks and the Habit of Success, When Willpower Becomes Automatic. Chapter 6, The Power of a Crisis, How Leaders Create Habits Through Accident and Design. Chapter 7, How Target Knows What You Want Before You Do, When Companies Predict Habits. Chapter 8, Saddleback Church and the Montgomery Bus Boycott, How Movements Happen. Chapter 9, The Neurology of Free Will. Are we responsible for our habits? Let's begin this journey, one chapter at a time. Chapter 1, The Habit Loop, How Habits Work. Eugene Pauly lost his memory, but he could still walk to the corner store and back. Think about that for a moment. A man who couldn't remember what he had for breakfast, who couldn't tell you his address, who didn't recognize his own neighborhood, but somehow navigate a complex route through streets that should have been completely foreign to him. The scientists studying Eugene discovered something extraordinary. While his conscious mind had been damaged, something deeper remained intact. Something that existed below the level of awareness, below the level of memory, below the level of conscious thought. His habits had survived when everything else was gone. This is where our story begins. Deep inside your brain, in a region called the basal ganglia, there's a process happening right now that's more important than your conscious thoughts. It's creating the patterns that will determine how you spend your evening, how you'll interact with your family, whether you'll exercise tomorrow, what you'll eat for lunch. The basal ganglia doesn't care about your goals or your dreams. It only cares about efficiency. It's constantly looking for ways to save mental energy, to convert conscious behaviors into automatic routines. And it does this through something called the habit loop. Every habit, whether it's checking your phone, biting your nails, or going for a morning run, follows the same neurological pattern. There's a cue, a trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode. Then there's a routine, the behavior itself, the thing you actually do. And finally, there's a reward, something that helps your brain remember this particular loop is worth storing for the future. Imagine Lisa, a woman who found herself eating cookies every afternoon at work. She felt guilty about it, tried to stop, but found herself walking to the cafeteria at 3:30 p.m. every single day. She thought she lacked willpower. But when she examined her habit loop, she discovered something different. The cue wasn't hunger, it was boredom. That mid-afternoon slump when her energy dipped and her mind started wandering. The routine was walking to the cafeteria and buying a cookie. The reward wasn't the cookie itself. It was the brief social interaction with colleagues, the momentary escape from her desk, the feeling of connection in an otherwise isolating day. Once Lisa understood this, everything changed. She kept the same cue and the same reward, but she changed the routine. Instead of walking to the cafeteria, she walked to a colleague's desk for a quick chat. The craving was satisfied, but in a way that aligned with her goals. This is the first profound truth about habits. They're not inherently good or bad. They're simply loops that your brain has created to make your life more efficient. The question isn't whether you have habits. The question is whether your habits are serving you or enslaving you. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. Your brain doesn't distinguish between good habits and bad habits. It treats them all the same. It's the same neurological pattern that helps you automatically brush your teeth is the same pattern that makes you automatically reach for your phone when you're anxious. This is why willpower alone isn't enough. You're not fighting a behavior. You're fighting a neurological pattern that's been carved into your brain through repetition. But understanding this pattern is the first step to changing it. The habit loop isn't just an abstract concept. It's visible in brain scans. When researchers studied people learning new habits, they could actually watch the brain activity change. At first, the entire brain lit up as people consciously learned new behaviors. But as the behaviors became automatic, brain activity decreased. The basal ganglia took over, creating efficient patterns that required minimal conscious effort. This is the beautiful and terrifying truth about being human. We are creatures of habit not by choice but by design. Our brains are literally rewiring themselves based on what we do repeatedly. Every time you follow a routine, you're strengthening neural pathways. Every time you repeat a pattern, you're making it more automatic. But this isn't a prison, it's a tool. Once you understand how the habit loop works, you can use it intentionally. You can design cues that trigger the behaviors you want. You can create routines that move you toward your goals. You can structure rewards that reinforce the patterns you want to strengthen. The power isn't in eliminating habits. The power is in understanding them and then consciously choosing which ones to cultivate. Eugene Pauly couldn't remember his own name, but his brain remembered the route to the store. Your brain is recording patterns right now, creating the template for who you'll be tomorrow. The question is, what template are you creating? Chapter 2. The Craving Brain. How to Create New Habits. Claude Hopkins was a failed advertising executive until he figured out how to make America brush their teeth. In 1915, only 7% of Americans had toothpaste in their medicine cabinets. Dental hygiene was not a habit. It was barely even a concept. Hopkins had tried everything. He emphasized health benefits, warned about tooth decay, appealed to vanity. Nothing worked. Americans remained indifferent to dental care. Then he discovered something that changed everything. Something that would revolutionize not just advertising, but our understanding of how habits are born. He focused on the film on teeth. That slightly rough feeling you get when you run your tongue across your teeth. Hopkins made people aware of this sensation, then positioned his toothpaste as the solution. Suddenly, people began to crave the clean, smooth feeling that came after brushing. Within a decade, toothpaste had become a necessity in American homes. Hopkins had stumbled onto the secret ingredient of habit formation: craving. It's not enough to have a Q&A reward. You need something more primal, something that creates anticipation, something that makes your brain yearn for the reward before you've even started the routine. Think about Pavlov's dogs. They didn't just salivate when they got food. They salivated when they heard the bell before the food arrived. Their brains had learned to anticipate the reward. They had developed a craving. This is what separates automatic behaviors from true habits. Automatic behaviors are things you do without thinking. Habits are things you do because not doing them feels wrong. The difference is craving. Consider your morning coffee ritual. You don't just drink coffee because you need caffeine. You crave that first sip, the warmth of the mug in your hands, the rich aroma that fills your senses. Your brain begins anticipating this reward the moment you smell coffee brewing, maybe even before you're fully awake. Or think about checking your phone. You don't just look at your phone because you need information. You crave the small hit of connection, the possibility of something interesting. It's a brief escape from whatever you're currently doing. Your brain has learned to anticipate this reward, creating a craving that pulls you toward your device dozens of times a day. This is why some habits feel effortless while others feel impossible. The effortless ones have developed powerful cravings. The impossible ones haven't. But here's the fascinating part. Cravings can be manufactured. They can be deliberately created. And once you understand how, you can design habits that stick. Take exercise, something most people struggle to make habitual. The typical approach focuses on the routine, the physical act of working out. But the real power lies in cultivating the craving. Maybe it's the endorphin rush you feel afterward. Maybe it's the sense of accomplishment. Maybe it's the way your body feels strong and capable. The key is identifying what you genuinely crave about the experience, then designing cues that trigger that anticipation. Maybe you lay out your workout clothes the night before, creating a visual cue that makes you anticipate feeling strong. Maybe you create a pre-workout playlist that makes you crave the energy and focus that comes with exercise. E. Wenzel, a researcher studying habit formation, discovered that people who successfully developed exercise habits had learned to crave something specific about the experience. It wasn't the exercise itself. It was the emotional state that exercise created. Once their brains learned to anticipate that emotional state, the physical routine became automatic. This is why the most powerful habits often seem to develop accidentally. You don't consciously decide to crave your morning coffee. You don't deliberately choose to anticipate the feeling of a clean house. These cravings emerge naturally as your brain learns to predict the rewards that certain behaviors provide. But they can also be cultivated intentionally. The key is paying attention to the rewards you actually experience, not the rewards you think you should want. Your brain is constantly evaluating the outcomes of your behaviors, deciding which ones are worth repeating. When you identify what you genuinely find rewarding about a behavior, you can amplify that reward, making it more memorable and more craving-worthy. The most successful habit changers understand this instinctively. They don't just focus on the behavior they want to change. They focus on the craving they want to create. They ask themselves, what is it about this new routine that my brain could learn to anticipate? What reward could I structure that would make this behavior feel necessary rather than optional? This is the difference between forcing yourself to do something and training yourself to want to do it. Force is exhausting and unsustainable. Craving is automatic and self-reinforcing. Your brain is already creating cravings. Right now, it's learning to anticipate the rewards that your current behaviors provide. The question isn't whether you'll have cravings. The question is whether you'll have cravings that serve your goals or cravings that sabotage them. The power to choose lies in understanding how cravings are born and then consciously nurturing the ones that will create the life you want to live. Chapter 3. The Golden Rule of Habit Change. Why Transformation Occurs. Tony Dungy was a failing football coach until he discovered something that would revolutionize how we think about change. His teams were talented, well-trained, and motivated. But when the pressure mounted, when the game was on the line, they reverted to old patterns. They made the same mistakes, repeated the same errors, fell into the same traps. Dungy realized something profound. You can't eliminate a habit. You can only change it. The key to changing it isn't willpower or motivation. It's something much more fundamental. The golden rule of habit change is simple but revolutionary. Keep the same cue, keep the same reward, but change the routine. This isn't just a strategy. It's how the brain works. It's how transformation actually happens. Think about it. When you try to eliminate a habit entirely, you're fighting against deeply grooved neural pathways. You're attempting to ignore cues that your brain has learned to recognize, to resist rewards that your brain has learned to crave. It's like trying to dam a river instead of redirecting it. But when you keep the cue and the reward and simply change the routine, you're working with your brain's natural patterns instead of against them. You're redirecting the river instead of trying to stop it. This is what Dungy did with his football teams. Instead of teaching them new plays for every situation, he simplified everything. Kept the same cues, the same reads, the same decision points, but he changed the responses. He made the new responses so automatic that when pressure mounted, when conscious thought became impossible, his players would automatically execute the new patterns instead of reverting to old ones. It worked. Duhigg's teams began winning in high-pressure situations. They developed what he called championship habits, patterns that served them when it mattered most. But the golden rule isn't just about football. It's about every area of human change. Consider someone trying to quit smoking. The traditional approach is to avoid the cues, to resist the urges, to eliminate the behavior entirely. But this fights against the established habit loop. A more effective approach might be to identify the real cue and the real reward. Maybe the cue isn't stress itself, but the feeling of wanting to step away from work. Maybe the reward isn't nicotine, but the brief moment of solitude, the deep breathing, the temporary escape from responsibility. Once you understand this, you can keep the same cue and the same reward, but change the routine. Instead of stepping outside for a cigarette, you step outside for a brief walk. Instead of lighting up, you practice deep breathing. The craving is satisfied, but in a way that aligns with your goals. This is why some people can quit smoking easily, while others struggle for years. The successful quitters, often unconsciously, have found routines that satisfy the same cravings that cigarettes satisfied. They've changed the routine while keeping the cue and reward intact. The golden rule also explains why some changes stick while others don't. When you try to create a new habit from scratch, you're asking your brain to establish an entirely new neural pathway. It's possible, but it's difficult and energy-intensive. But when you modify an existing habit, you're using pathways that already exist. You're leveraging the brain's existing architecture instead of trying to build new architecture from nothing. This is the secret behind successful habit change programs. Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't just tell people to stop drinking. It provides a new routine that responds to the same cues and provides similar rewards. The cue might be stress or social anxiety. The old routine was drinking. The new routine is calling a sponsor, attending a meeting, working through the steps. The reward is still stress relief and social connection, but it's achieved through a different routine. The program works because it honors the golden rule. It doesn't try to eliminate the habit loop. It redirects it. But here's where it gets interesting. The golden rule also explains why willpower alone isn't enough. When you rely on willpower to resist a cue or ignore a craving, you're fighting against your brain's natural patterns. It's exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. But when you redirect a habit using the golden rule, you're working with your brain's natural patterns. It requires less energy and becomes more automatic over time. This is why the most successful changes feel effortless once they're established. They're not eliminating old patterns, they're redirecting them. The golden rule also reveals why change is often easier during times of transition. When you move to a new city, start a new job, or experience a major life change, many of your environmental cues are disrupted. This creates an opportunity to establish new routines without fighting against old ones. But you don't have to wait for major life changes. You can create smaller disruptions that make habit change easier. You can change your environment, modify your schedule, or alter your routine in ways that make new behaviors feel more natural. The key is understanding that every habit you want to change is already working perfectly. It's serving some function in your life, satisfying some craving, providing some reward. The question isn't whether the habit is good or bad. The question is whether you can find a better routine that serves the same function. This is the art of habit change. It's not about elimination. It's about redirection. It's not about fighting against your brain's natural patterns. It's about working with them to create the life you want. Chapter 4. Keystone Habits. Or the Ballad of Paul O'Neill, Which Habits Matter Most. Paul O'Neill became the CEO of Alcoa in 1987. His first speech to investors was a disaster. Instead of talking about profits or market share, he talked about worker safety. Instead of promising increased earnings, he promised that no one would get hurt making aluminum. The investors were baffled. Some quietly sold their stock. This wasn't what they expected from a Fortune 500 CEO. But O'Neill understood something about change that most leaders miss. Some habits are more important than others. Some habits have the power to transform everything. Worker safety was what O'Neill called a keystone habit. Like the keystone in an arch, it was the one element that held everything else together. When you change a keystone habit, It creates a chain reaction that transforms other patterns automatically. Here's what happened at Alcoa. To improve safety, workers had to communicate better. They had to report problems immediately. They had to suggest improvements. This created a culture of openness and continuous improvement. To track safety metrics, the company had to improve their information systems. They had to collect data faster, analyze it more effectively, share it more widely. This created better decision-making processes throughout the organization. To prevent accidents, workers had to be trained better. They had to understand the manufacturing process more deeply. They had to take ownership of their work environment. This created higher engagement and better quality. One habit, worker safety, transformed communication, information flow, training, quality, and employee engagement. Within a year, Alcoa's profits hit record highs. By the time O'Neill retired, the company's annual net income was 5 times larger than when he arrived. But this isn't just a business story. Keystone habits exist in every area of life. They're the patterns that trigger other patterns, creating cascading changes that transform entire systems. Consider exercise. For many people, regular exercise is a keystone habit. They start working out consistently, they naturally begin eating better, they sleep more regularly, they feel more confident, they become more organized, they're more productive at work. One habit triggers a chain reaction that improves multiple areas of life. Or think about family dinners. When families eat together regularly, children perform better in school, they have fewer behavioral problems, they're less likely to engage in risky behaviors. Family communication improves. Stress levels decrease. One simple habit creates positive changes throughout the entire family system. The power of keystone habits lies in their ability to create what researchers call small wins. These are exactly what they sound like: minor victories that trigger positive changes in other areas. When you successfully establish a keystone habit, you prove to yourself that change is possible. You develop confidence in your ability to modify your behavior. You create momentum that makes other changes feel more achievable. But keystone habits also work on a deeper level. They often change your sense of identity. When you become someone who exercises regularly, you start seeing yourself as a healthy person. This identity shift influences other behaviors automatically. You choose healthier foods not because you're following a diet, but because that's what healthy people do. When you become someone who keeps a clean house, you start seeing yourself as an organized person. This identity shift influences how you approach your work, your relationships, your entire life. You organize your schedule, your priorities, your thoughts, because that's what organized people do. This is why keystone habits are so powerful. They don't just change what you do, they change who you are. And when your identity changes, your behaviors change automatically to match. But not all habits are keystone habits. Some habits exist in isolation, having little impact on other areas of life. The key is identifying which habits have the potential to create cascading changes in your particular situation. For some people, keeping a food journal is a keystone habit. The act of writing down what they eat makes them more conscious of their choices, which leads to better eating, which leads to more energy, which leads to better mood, which leads to improved relationships and work performance. For others, making their bed every morning is a keystone habit. It creates a sense of accomplishment first thing in the morning, which sets a positive tone for the day, which leads to better productivity, which leads to better mood, which leads to better relationships and health habits. The specific keystone habit matters less than its ability to create positive changes in other areas. The key is identifying habits that naturally lead to other positive behaviors in your life. Lisa Allen, a woman who transformed her life by quitting smoking, discovered that her keystone habit was running. She didn't start running to get fit. She started running to deal with the stress of quitting cigarettes. But running led to better eating, which led to better sleep, which led to better work performance, which led to better relationships. Within 2 years, she had paid off her credit cards, completed a master's degree, and gotten engaged. One habit, running, triggered a complete life transformation. But it only worked because Lisa unconsciously chose a keystone habit, a behavior that naturally connected to other positive changes. The art of personal change isn't about willpower or motivation. It's about identifying the right keystone habit for your situation and focusing your energy there. When you change a keystone habit, you don't just change one behavior, You change the entire system. This is why some people can transform their lives with what seems like a small change, while others struggle to make progress despite enormous effort. The successful ones, often unconsciously, have identified and focused on their keystone habits. The question isn't whether you can change. The question is whether you can identify which change will matter most. Chapter 5. Starbucks and the Habit of Success. When willpower becomes automatic. Travis Leach was 19 years old when he dropped out of high school. He was using drugs, living in his car, and had no prospects for the future. 5 years later, he was managing a Starbucks store, earning $40,000 a year, and had turned his life around completely. What happened? Did Travis suddenly develop superhuman willpower? Did he have some kind of personality transformation? Did he discover hidden reserves of motivation? None of the above. Travis learned something that most people never understand. Willpower isn't a character trait. It's a habit. And like any habit, it can be strengthened through practice. Starbucks discovered this accidentally. The company was hiring thousands of young people who, like Travis, often lacked what traditional employers called soft skills. They struggled with self-discipline, communication, and emotional regulation. They would get overwhelmed during busy periods, argue with customers, or simply not show up for work. Traditional training programs focused on procedures and policies. Starbucks tried something different. They focused on habits. They created specific routines for dealing with stress, handling difficult customers, and maintaining composure under pressure. They didn't just tell employees to be polite to customers. They created a habit loop. When a customer seemed angry, employees would follow a specific routine. Listen to the complaint, apologize, offer to make it right, and follow up. The reward was seeing the customer's mood improve and feeling successful at their job. They didn't just tell employees to stay calm during rush periods. They created specific routines for managing stress. When the store got busy, employees would follow breathing exercises, use positive self-talk, and focus on one task at a time. The reward was feeling in control and capable. These weren't just job skills, they were life skills. Employees were learning to automatically respond to stressful situations with helpful routines instead of destructive ones. This is the secret that Starbucks discovered. Willpower isn't about having strong character. It's about developing automatic responses to challenging situations. It's about creating habits that help you do the right thing even when you don't feel like it. Research supports this understanding. Studies show that people who seem to have great willpower aren't actually resisting temptation more often. They're structuring their lives to avoid temptation in the first place. They're creating environments and routines that make good choices automatic. Consider two people trying to eat healthier. The first person relies on willpower to resist junk food. Every time they see cookies, chips, or candy, they have to make a conscious decision to resist. This is exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. The second person creates habits that make healthy eating automatic. They shop on Sunday, preparing healthy meals for the week. They keep healthy snacks visible and accessible. They remove junk food from their environment. They establish routines that make healthy choices the easy choices. The second person isn't more disciplined. They're more systematic. They've turned willpower into habits. This is what Starbucks did for their employees. They took situations that typically required willpower and created automatic responses. They turned character traits into habit loops. But the really interesting part is what happened to employees like Travis. As they practiced these habits at work, they began applying them to other areas of their lives. They used the same stress management techniques with their families. They used the same communication skills in their relationships. Used the same self-discipline practices with their personal goals. The habits they learned at Starbucks became the foundation for transforming their entire lives. They'd learned to make willpower automatic. This reveals something profound about human nature. We often think willpower is about restriction, about saying no to things we want. But real willpower is about creating systems that make good choices feel natural and automatic. It's about designing your environment so that healthy foods are more convenient than junk food. It's about structuring your schedule so that exercise feels like a natural part of your day. It's about creating routines that help you respond to stress in productive ways. The most successful people understand this instinctively. They don't rely on motivation to get things done. They create habits that make important behaviors automatic. they turn willpower into systems. This is why some people seem to effortlessly maintain healthy habits while others struggle. The effortless ones have created automatic responses to the situations that typically require willpower. They've made good choices feel natural. But here's the key insight. These systems can be learned. Willpower can be strengthened. You can create habits that make discipline feel automatic. The process is the same as creating any habit. You identify the cue, the situation that typically requires willpower. You design a routine, a specific response that moves you toward your goals. You structure a reward, something that makes your brain want to repeat the pattern. Maybe the cue is feeling stressed about work. Instead of automatically reaching for comfort food, you create a routine of taking a short walk or doing breathing exercises. The reward is feeling more calm and in control. Maybe the cue is feeling tired in the evening. Instead of automatically turning on the TV, you create a routine of reading for 30 minutes. The reward is feeling more relaxed and accomplished. These aren't just isolated behaviors. They're investments in your future self. Every time you successfully execute a willpower habit, you're strengthening your ability to make good choices automatically. This is what Travis learned at Starbucks. He learned that he wasn't weak or undisciplined. Simply hadn't learned the habits that make good choices feel natural. Once he learned those habits, everything changed. The question isn't whether you have willpower. The question is whether you've learned to make willpower automatic. Chapter 6. The Power of a Crisis. How Leaders Create Habits Through Accident and Design. The Rhode Island hospital was one of the best medical facilities in the country, but it was killing people. Not through incompetence or malice, but through habits. Dangerous, ingrained patterns that had become so automatic that nobody questioned them anymore. Nurses were afraid to speak up when they saw doctors making mistakes. Surgeons operated on the wrong body parts because safety protocols had become routines that people followed without thinking. The hospital's culture had created habits that prioritized hierarchy over patient safety. Then Martin, a respected surgeon, operated on the wrong side of an 86-year-old patient's head. The patient died. The media coverage was devastating. The state health department launched an investigation. The hospital faced lawsuits, regulatory action, and a crisis of confidence. But something interesting happened. The crisis created an opportunity. When the existing habits were suddenly called into question, when the status quo became unacceptable, the hospital was able to implement changes that had been impossible before. They created new protocols for verifying patient identity. They established habits that required everyone, regardless of rank, to speak up about safety concerns. They implemented systems that made it easier to do the right thing than to follow the dangerous old patterns. The crisis had disrupted the old habits and created space for new ones. Within 2 years, the hospital's safety record improved dramatically. The same people who had been trapped in dangerous patterns were now automatically following life-saving procedures. This is the power of crisis. It disrupts existing habits and creates opportunities for new ones. It makes change possible that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. But here's the fascinating part. The most effective leaders don't wait for crises to happen. They create them. Deliberately disrupt existing patterns to make space for new ones. Consider Tony Xia at Zappos. The company was growing rapidly, but Xia was concerned about maintaining their culture of customer service. He could have implemented new policies or training programs. Instead, he created a deliberate crisis. He announced that the company was adopting a radical new organizational structure called holacracy. He eliminated traditional management hierarchies. He told employees they could either embrace the new system or take a generous severance package. The announcement created chaos. Employees were confused, anxious, and uncertain. Many left the company. But those who stayed had to develop new habits. They had to learn to communicate differently, make decisions differently, work together differently. She had deliberately disrupted the old habits and created space for new ones. He had used the power of crisis to transform the organization. This isn't manipulation. It's leadership. The most effective leaders understand that people's habits are often more powerful than their conscious intentions. They understand that sometimes you have to disrupt existing patterns to create space for better ones. But crisis-driven change isn't just about organizations. It works in personal life too. People often make major changes after health scares, relationship problems, or career setbacks. The crisis disrupts their existing habits and creates an opportunity for new ones. The key is understanding that crisis itself isn't enough. Crisis creates opportunity, but it doesn't guarantee change. The opportunity has to be channeled into new habits, new routines, new patterns. This is why some people emerge from crises transformed, while others return to old patterns. The transformed ones use the disruption to establish new habits. The others wait for the crisis to pass and then revert to familiar routines. The art of crisis-driven change is knowing how to use disruption constructively. It's about having a plan for the new habits you want to create, not just the old ones you want to eliminate. Consider someone who has a heart attack. The crisis disrupts their existing habits around food, exercise, and stress management. They have a window of opportunity to establish new patterns. But if they don't consciously create new habits, they'll likely return to old ones once the immediate fear subsides. The successful ones use the crisis to establish specific new routines. They create habits around checking food labels, taking daily walks, and managing stress. They use the disruption to their advantage. But you don't have to wait for a health scare to create this kind of change. You can create smaller disruptions that make new habits easier to establish. You can change your environment, your schedule, your routine in ways that make better choices feel more natural. The key is understanding that habits are most malleable during times of disruption. When your normal routines are interrupted, your brain is more open to new patterns. This is why changes often stick better when they're made during vacations, moves, job changes, or other transitions. Smart leaders and individuals understand this principle. Don't just wait for crises to happen. It creates strategic disruptions that make positive changes more likely. This might mean changing your physical environment to support new habits. It might mean altering your schedule to make better choices feel more natural. It might mean surrounding yourself with people who embody the patterns you want to adopt. The power of crisis isn't about drama or chaos. It's about disruption. It's about creating space for new patterns to emerge. It's about understanding that sometimes you have to break old habits before you can build new ones. The question isn't whether you'll face disruption in your life. The question is whether you'll use that disruption to create the habits you want. Chapter 7. How Target knows what you want before you do. When companies predict habits, Andrew Pohl had a problem. He was a statistician at Target, and his job was to figure out how to get customers to buy more stuff. But people's shopping habits were incredibly predictable. They bought the same brands, shopped at the same times, followed the same routines week after week. Pohl's breakthrough came when he realized that there were certain moments when people's habits became vulnerable. Moments when they were open to new patterns, new brands, new behaviors. And the most powerful moment was when someone was having a baby. New parents buy enormous amounts of stuff. Diapers, formula, baby clothes, strollers, cribs. But more importantly, they're in a state of complete routine disruption. Their old habits don't work anymore. They're desperate for new solutions, new products, new ways of doing things. Pohl realized that if Target could identify pregnant women and start marketing to them during their second trimester, they could capture enormous amounts of future business. But how do you identify pregnant women who haven't told you they're pregnant? Pohl analyzed the purchasing patterns of women who had signed up for Target's baby registry, discovered that pregnant women started buying certain products at predictable times. Unscented lotions in the first trimester. Vitamins and supplements in the second. Cotton balls and washcloths in the third. Using this data, Target could assign every customer a pregnancy prediction score. They could identify women who were likely pregnant based on their shopping patterns alone. They could start sending targeted advertisements for baby products before women even realized they needed them. The system worked perfectly, too perfectly. Target started sending diaper coupons to teenagers. Baby formula ads to women who hadn't told their families they were pregnant yet. A father in Minneapolis called Target to complain about the baby-related mailers his teenage daughter was receiving, only to learn a few days later that she was indeed pregnant. Target had learned to predict and manipulate habits with frightening accuracy. They had figured out how to identify the moments when people's routines were most vulnerable and insert themselves into those moments. But this isn't just about retail. This is about understanding how habits work in the modern world. Every company, every app, every service you use is studying your patterns, looking for ways to create new habits that benefit them. Think about how Netflix keeps you watching. They've studied your viewing habits, identified the moments when you're most likely to stop watching, and created features that keep you engaged. The autoplay function isn't just convenient, it's designed to prevent the moment when you might consciously decide to stop watching. Consider how social media platforms keep you scrolling. They've analyzed your engagement patterns, identified what type of content keeps you most engaged, and created algorithms that serve you exactly what you're most likely to interact with. The infinite scroll isn't just a design choice, it's a habit-forming mechanism. Or think about how food companies create products that are hard to resist. They've studied the neurological patterns that create cravings, identified the perfect combination of salt, sugar, and fat that triggers automatic consumption, and engineered products that activate your brain's reward systems. These companies understand something that most people don't. Habits can be manufactured. They can be deliberately designed and systematically implemented. Once they're established, they become incredibly difficult to break. But here's what's really fascinating. The same techniques that companies use to create habits can be used to create positive changes in your own life. The science of habit formation doesn't distinguish between commercial and personal applications. When Target identified the moments when people's habits were most vulnerable, they discovered a universal principle. Transitions are opportunities. When people move, change jobs, have babies, or experience other major life changes, their established routines are disrupted. They're more open to new patterns. You can use this principle in your own life. Instead of trying to change habits during stable periods, you can plan changes around natural transitions. Moving to a new city is a perfect time to establish new exercise routines. Starting a new job is an ideal moment to develop better work habits. Having a baby is an opportunity to create new family rituals. The key is recognizing these vulnerable moments and being intentional about the habits you want to create. Instead of letting random influences shape your new patterns, you can consciously design the routines that will serve your goals. But there's a darker side to this knowledge. Understanding how habits work also means understanding how they can be manipulated. Every time you use a smartphone, visit a website, or enter a store, you're encountering systems designed to shape your behavior. The question isn't whether you'll be influenced by these systems. The question is whether you'll be conscious of their influence and intentional about your responses. This requires developing what researchers call habit awareness. It means paying attention to the cues that trigger your behaviors, the routines you follow automatically, and the rewards that reinforce your patterns. When you understand how your habits work, you can make conscious choices about which ones to keep and which ones to change. You can recognize when companies are trying to manipulate your behavior and decide whether to allow it. You can also use the same principles to create positive changes in your own life. You can design cues that trigger healthy behaviors. You can structure rewards that reinforce good habits, and create systems that make positive choices feel automatic. The power of habit isn't neutral. It can be used to manipulate or to liberate, to control or to empower. The difference lies in who's designing the systems and for what purpose. Companies like Target have shown us that habits can be predicted, influenced, and changed with remarkable precision. The question is whether you'll use this knowledge to create the life you want, or whether you'll allow others to use it to create the behaviors they want from you. Chapter 8. Saddleback Church and the Montgomery Bus Boycott. How Movements Happen. Rosa Parks was not the first person to refuse to give up her bus seat. She wasn't even the most obvious choice to become the symbol of the civil rights movement. She was a quiet seamstress who had worked long hours and just wanted to go home. But Rosa Parks had something that previous protesters didn't have. She was connected to multiple social networks that bridged different communities. She was a member of the NAACP, but she was also involved in the local Methodist church. She worked with white liberals, but she was also respected by working-class African Americans. When Parks was arrested, the news spread through interconnected social networks that had never been activated for a single cause before. The habit of social compliance that had kept people riding segregated buses was suddenly disrupted. A new pattern emerged, the habit of resistance. The Montgomery bus boycott wasn't just about one woman's act of defiance. It was about how social habits spread through communities and create movements that can change the world. Every social movement follows the same pattern. It starts with the social habits of friendship and strong ties between close acquaintances. It grows through the habits of communities and weak ties between people who don't know each other well. and it endures through new habits of self-direction and identity. Think about the friendship habits that made the boycott possible. Parks wasn't just an individual making a personal choice. She was part of a tight-knit community where people looked out for each other. When she was arrested, her friends felt personally obligated to respond. They had habits of mutual support that turned individual action into collective response. E.D. Nixon, a local NAACP leader and friend of Parks, immediately called other activists. Jo Ann Robinson, who led the Women's Political Council, stayed up all night printing leaflets. These weren't calculated political decisions. They were automatic responses triggered by friendship habits. But friendship habits alone weren't enough to sustain a boycott. The movement needed to spread beyond close-knit groups to the broader community. This is where weak ties became crucial. Weak ties are the connections between people who don't know each other well, but share some common experience. They're the relationships between acquaintances, colleagues, members of the same organization who aren't necessarily friends. Like in Montgomery, the African American community was connected by weak ties through churches, schools, social clubs, and neighborhoods. When the boycott started, people participated not because they were close friends with Rosa Parks, but because they felt social pressure from their communities. The boycott organizers understood this instinctively. They didn't just ask people to walk instead of riding buses. They created social habits that made participation feel necessary. They organized carpools through churches, created walking groups for safety. They established meeting routines that kept people connected to the movement. Most importantly, they made boycott participation visible. When people walked to work, their neighbors could see they were participating. When they organized carpools, their communities could see they were committed. The social pressure to participate became stronger than the inconvenience of walking. This is how social habits work. They spread through communities not because people are convinced by arguments, but because they feel social pressure to conform to what others are doing. But the Montgomery bus boycott reveals something even more profound about social change. The movement didn't just change behavior, it changed identity. People who had seen themselves as powerless began to see themselves as agents of change. This identity shift created new habits of self-direction. People began organizing their own carpools, planning their own meetings, creating their own solutions. They developed habits of leadership and self-reliance that extended far beyond the boycott itself. When the boycott ended after 381 days, the participants had developed new social habits. They had learned to work together, to organize collectively, to resist injustice. These habits became the foundation for the broader civil rights movement. This pattern repeats in every successful social movement. The Tea Party movement spread through friendship networks and church communities. The Obama campaign created new habits of political participation through social media and neighborhood organizing. The Arab Spring movements used technology to create new patterns of collective action. But social movements aren't just about politics. They're about any situation where social habits spread through communities and create collective change. Think about how fitness trends spread through social networks. When someone starts running marathons, their friends become more likely to exercise. When someone changes their diet, their family members often follow suit. These aren't individual decisions. They're social habits spreading through communities. Consider how workplace cultures change. When new employees join a company, they quickly adopt the social habits of their colleagues. They learn not just the formal policies, but the informal patterns of how people actually behave. And when these patterns shift, entire organizations can transform. The key insight is that social habits are incredibly powerful, but they're also incredibly fragile. They depend on social pressure and community reinforcement. When these supports are removed, the habits often disappear. This is why some social movements create lasting change while others fade away. The lasting ones don't just change behavior. They change identity. They create new habits of self-direction that persist even when social pressure decreases. The Montgomery bus boycott worked because it created new social habits that spread through communities and new personal habits that changed how people saw themselves. It wasn't just about riding buses. It was about becoming the kind of people who could change the world. Every social movement is ultimately about habit change. It's about disrupting old patterns and creating new ones. It's about understanding how social habits spread and using that knowledge to create positive change. The question isn't whether you'll be influenced by social movements. The question is whether you'll be intentional about which movements you join and which habits you allow to spread through your communities. Chapter 9. The Neurology of Free Will. Are we responsible for our habits? Angie Bachman had a problem with gambling, but she didn't know it was a problem. She was a successful mother and wife, living in a nice house in a good neighborhood. She played the slots at the casino once a week just for fun. It was harmless entertainment, a way to relax and escape from the stresses of daily life. But something was happening in Angie's brain that she couldn't see. Every time she pulled the slot machine handle, her brain released dopamine, creating a small pleasure response. Over time, her brain began to crave this response. The weekly visits became twice weekly, then daily. The small bets became larger ones. Within a few years, Angie had lost her house, her marriage, and her children's college funds. She had become addicted to gambling, but she insisted she was making conscious choices. She believed she was in control. The neuroscience of habit formation reveals a troubling truth. Much of what we think of as conscious choice is actually automatic behavior. Our brains are constantly creating patterns that operate below the level of awareness. We think we're making decisions, but we're often just following established routines. This raises a fundamental question. If our habits are created by neurological processes we don't control, are we responsible for them? If our brains are programmed to repeat behaviors automatically, do we have free will? The answer is both yes and no. We're not responsible for having habits. That's how the human brain works. But we are responsible for changing them once we understand how they work. Think about it this way. You're not responsible for having a habit of checking your phone when you're bored. That's a natural response to the way your brain processes stimuli and rewards. But once you understand this habit, once you recognize the cue and the routine and the reward, you become responsible for what you do with that knowledge. This is the difference between being a victim of your habits and being their architect. When you understand how habits work, you gain the power to change them. When you remain unconscious of them, you remain trapped by them. The neuroscience is clear. Habits are created by neurological processes that operate automatically. But awareness of these processes gives us the ability to intervene. We can't eliminate the habit loop, but we can redirect it. Consider Angie's story. She wasn't responsible for developing a gambling addiction. Her brain responded to the casino environment exactly as it was designed to respond. The lights, sounds, and intermittent rewards triggered neurological patterns that created craving. But once Angie understood how her addiction worked, she became responsible for addressing it. She learned to recognize the cues that triggered her gambling urges. She developed new routines for dealing with stress and boredom. She restructured her environment to avoid triggers. The key insight is that responsibility isn't about blame. It's about responsibility. It's about your ability to respond to your habits once you understand them. This has profound implications for how we think about personal change. It means that people aren't weak or undisciplined when they struggle with habits. They're simply operating with neurological patterns that haven't been consciously examined. But it also means that change is possible for everyone, no matter how ingrained a habit might be, no matter how automatic it feels. Understanding how it works creates the possibility of changing it. The most successful people aren't those who have perfect habits. They're those who understand how habits work and use that knowledge to create patterns that serve their goals. This is why education about habits is so important. When people understand the neurological basis of their behavior, they stop seeing themselves as victims and start seeing themselves as architects. But there's another layer to this question of responsibility. Not all habits are created equal. Some habits are created by natural neurological processes. Others are created by companies, institutions, and environments that are deliberately designed to shape behavior. When casinos use specific lighting, sounds, and reward schedules to create gambling habits, are individuals fully responsible for their responses? When food companies engineer products to trigger overconsumption, are people entirely to blame for their eating habits? The answer is nuanced. We're responsible for our responses, but we're also operating in environments that are designed to influence our behavior. True responsibility requires understanding both our own neurological patterns and the external forces that shape them. This is why awareness is so crucial. When you understand how your habits work and how they're influenced by your environment, you can make conscious choices about which influences to accept and which to resist. You can design your environment to support the habits you want. You can avoid situations that trigger unwanted patterns. You can create cues that prompt desired behaviors, You can structure rewards that reinforce positive changes. The neurology of free will isn't about having complete control over your behavior. It's about having conscious influence over your patterns. It's about understanding how your brain works and using that knowledge to create the life you want. But this understanding comes with responsibility. Once you know how habits work, you can't claim ignorance. You can't blame your circumstances or your genetics or your past. You can only choose whether to use your knowledge to create positive change. The question isn't whether you have free will. The question is whether you'll use your understanding of how habits work to create the patterns that serve your goals. This is the ultimate message of understanding habits. You are not a victim of your patterns. You are their architect. You have the power to examine them, understand them, and change them. But that power comes with responsibility. Once you understand how habits work, you become responsible for what you do with that knowledge. You become responsible for creating the patterns that will shape your future. The neurology of free will isn't about perfect control. It's about conscious influence. It's about understanding how your brain works and using that knowledge to create the life you want to live. We've traveled through 9 chapters, exploring the hidden architecture of human behavior. We've seen how habits form in the depths of our brains, how they spread through organizations and societies, how they can be changed and shaped and directed toward our goals. But this isn't really a book about habits. It's a book about human potential. It's about understanding that you are not fixed, that your patterns are not permanent, that change is not only possible but inevitable. Every day, your brain is creating new neural pathways based on what you do repeatedly. Every routine you follow, every response you make, every choice you repeat is literally reshaping who you are. You are not the same person you were yesterday, and you won't be the same person tomorrow. The question isn't whether you'll change. The question is whether you'll be conscious of that change and intentional about directing it. This is what makes being human so remarkable. We are not prisoners of our past or victims of our circumstances. We are architects of our own becoming. We have the power to examine our patterns, understand how they work, and reshape them to serve our deepest values. But this power comes with responsibility. Once you understand how habits work, you can't claim ignorance. You can't blame your genetics or your upbringing or your environment. You can only choose whether to use your knowledge to create positive change. The habits you choose to cultivate today will determine who you become tomorrow. The patterns you establish this week will shape next month. The routines you create this year will influence the rest of your life. This is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it means you are responsible for your own becoming. Liberating because it means you have the power to create the life you want. The science is clear. Habits can be understood, predicted, and changed. The neural pathways that create automatic behavior can be redirected toward any goal you choose. The same processes that create destructive patterns can create constructive ones. But knowledge without application is just entertainment. Understanding how habits work is only valuable if you use that understanding to create positive changes in your life. So here's my invitation to you. Start small. Choose one habit you want to change. Examine the cue, the routine, and the reward. Understand how the pattern works. Then begin the patient work of redirecting it towards something that serves your goals. Don't try to change everything at once. Don't rely on motivation or willpower. Instead, trust the process. Trust that small changes, repeated consistently, create profound transformations over time. Your future self is being created right now, in this moment, by the patterns you choose to follow. The habits you cultivate today will determine the person you become tomorrow. The power is in your hands. The choice is yours. The time is now. If this journey through the science of habits has resonated with you, if it's given you new insights into your own potential for change, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your experiences, your questions. Let's continue this conversation about what it means to be human in a world where change is not only possible, but inevitable. And if you'd like to explore more ideas about personal transformation, about the science of human potential, about what it means to create a life worth living, consider subscribing to this channel. We're building a community of people who believe that understanding how we work is the first step toward creating who we want to become. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for being curious about your own potential. Thank you for believing that change is possible. The habit loop is always running. The question is, what patterns will you choose to create?